I sat in the sterile silence of a one-bedroom apartment I never planned to rent, listening to the rhythmic hiss of my oxygen concentrator. The plastic tubing felt cold and rigid against my jaw, a constant reminder of my failing lungs. A faint, sharp smell of industrial bleach hung in the air, masking the warm scent of the home I had just been forced to leave. 68 years old, and my only son could not look me in the eye when I packed my bags. I had spent 30 years as a payroll supervisor for the county school district, making sure every teacher was paid on time, building a life on exact numbers. But I lost my family because I failed to count the true cost of my own breath. I thought my medical bills were bankrupting my son. I thought I was a burden who was stealing my granddaughter's future. The truth was far worse, and the printed web page resting on my lap proved it. Tens of thousands of dollars had been raised in my name. While I sat in the dark and gasped for air, the lie started quietly. It began on a Tuesday morning in early March. The portable oxygen tank beside my bed hissed a weak, dying note. I looked down at my hands in the dim light filtering through the window of the ground floor suite. My son Daniel and his wife Chelsea had converted for me. My fingertips carried a faint bluish tint. The smart choice, the medical choice, was to call the supplier for an emergency refill. But all I could hear was Chelsea's voice from the night before, complaining that the last delivery cost more than my granddaughter Lily's entire summer program. I reached for the dial and turned the flow down to a trickle. Every breath I took was taking money away from them, and I could not live with the guilt. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and tried to stand without the cannula. The room tilted immediately. My vision narrowed into a dark tunnel, and the floor rushed up to meet me. My shoulder hit the side table hard. The silver picture frame holding a photo of my late wife Elaine crashed to the hardwood floor, the glass shattering loud enough to echo through the quiet house. Footsteps hurried down the hall a moment later. The door swung open, and Chelsea stood in the frame with her robe tied tight across her waist. Chelsea did not kneel to check my breathing, nor did she ask if I was hurt. Her eyes darted over my shoulder toward the open hallway, checking to see if anyone else was awake. Stepping inside, my daughter-in-law pushed the door firmly shut until the latch clicked. "George, we talked about this," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You cannot keep creating emergencies we cannot afford." I tried to push myself up, my lungs burning for air. Before I could form an apology, heavy footsteps sounded outside. The doorknob turned. Daniel pushed his way into the room, his eyes wide with panic. In a fraction of a second, Chelsea dropped to her knees beside me. Her hands gently cradled my arm, and her voice softened into a pitch of absolute terror. "Oh, Dad, let me help you," she cried out. The flow was just too low. "Daniel, help me get him to the chair." Daniel looked at his wife with pure gratitude. He saw a devoted woman saving his fragile father. He never saw the locked door. At breakfast, the blue folder made its appearance. Chelsea placed it on the kitchen table right beside my oatmeal, opened it, and tapped a manicured finger against a piece of paper. It was a billing statement. "We had to delay the dishwasher repair again, George," she said, sliding the paper toward me. The top line showed a massive total charge. I reached for it, but her hand stayed firmly planted over the bottom half of the page, where the insurance adjustments would normally sit. I did not fight her for it. "Daniel is picking up a third overtime shift this week," she continued, her tone heavy with manufactured exhaustion. "Your equipment is just not sustainable. We are bleeding money." I stared at the bold numbers, shame radiating hot in my chest. "I am sorry, Chelsea. I will try to sit still today. Save the tank." Daniel stared down at his coffee. He looked uncomfortable, but he did not say a word to defend me or question her. His silence was the heaviest thing in the room. Later that afternoon, I walked toward the kitchen for a glass of water. Chelsea was standing by the island, holding her phone up at eye level. She was speaking in that breathless, emotional tone she usually saved for church testimonials. "It is the hardest season of our lives," she said to the camera. "But family means sacrifice, and we are just trusting the community right now." My foot creaked on the floorboard, and she snapped the phone down. The sad expression vanished instantly. "Just a church update," she said sharply. Then her eyes narrowed, studying my pale face. "Actually, come here. Sit by the window." I dragged my feet to the armchair by the glass. She raised her phone again. "Look out at the snow, George." Try to look strong but honest. I assumed it was for her prayer group. I did not ask questions because beggars do not get to dictate terms in someone else's house. A few minutes later, 9-year-old Lily skipped into the room holding a drawing of a house. She climbed onto the arm of my chair and rested her head against my shoulder. Grandpa, are you going to be here when I start middle school? The question knocked the breath out of me. I wrapped an arm around her small shoulders. Of course, sweetie. Why would you ask that? Lily traced a circle on her paper. Mommy says your machine costs a lot of money, and we might not have enough, but she is trying really hard. I closed my eyes. The guilt was a physical weight crushing my ribs. I kissed the top of her head and made a promise that could have killed me. Do not worry, Lily. Grandpa is going to use a lot less from now on. The doorbell rang just before noon. Carol, Chelsea's mother, bustled in carrying a heavy plastic container of chicken soup. She set it on the counter and walked straight into the living room to check on me. Her sharp eyes immediately caught the red warning light on my backup concentrator. Why is the machine not running, George? Your portable tank is almost dead. Chelsea appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. She did not miss a beat. The supplier is delayed again, she sighed, shaking her head. It is just another insurance denial. We are trying to figure out how to pay out of pocket. Carol stopped wiping down the side table. She stood up slowly, her brow furrowed. She looked from her daughter to the empty tank, and then back again. An insurance denial? Carol asked, her voice tight. I thought that was settled months ago. Chelsea's jaw tightened. Before she could answer, her cell phone rang from the kitchen counter. She seized the excuse, turned on her heel, and walked out of the room to answer it. The house fell perfectly quiet. Carol did not follow her daughter. She took a step closer to my chair, glancing over her shoulder toward the hallway. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but the words hit me like a physical blow. George, she said, leaning in. Did Chelsea ever let you speak to the people who paid for your oxygen? I stared at her. My chest tightened, and this time, it had nothing to do with my lungs. What people? Carol walked to the guest room door and turned the lock. A sharp click echoed in the quiet space, sealing us in. She pulled her smartphone from her purse, tapping the glass surface a few times before handing the device to me. The screen was bright, illuminating the dim corners of my room. It showed a web page where, at the very top, my full name was printed in large, bold letters. Right below the text sat a photograph of me. I was asleep in a hospital chair with my mouth slightly open, a clear plastic tube strapped across my pale face. Then my eyes found the number, raised $86,400. I blinked heavily, waiting for the digits to shift or disappear. They remained perfectly still. The text underneath the donation bar told a harrowing story about a desperate family. It claimed I was at imminent risk of losing access to my life-saving oxygen. The paragraph said Chelsea had emptied her personal savings account. Daniel was working 2 grueling jobs, and my 9-year-old granddaughter had given up her after-school activities just to keep me alive. Every single donation, the page promised, went directly toward my respiratory care. Carol reached over and scrolled down the page, her finger trembling slightly against the glass. Names rolled past my eyes in a blur of small text. The retired cafeteria manager from the high school where I used to handle the county payroll, members of the Harbor Light Community Church, neighbors from down the street, and right there near the top sat a massive donation from Carol Parker herself. Dozens of comments were attached to the money. They were messages praising my daughter-in-law for her courage, her sacrifice, and her unyielding devotion to her sick father-in-law. I did not know any of this existed, I whispered, my voice cracking on the final word. A deep, crawling heat spread across my neck and up into my cheeks. Strangers had been looking at me in my weakest moments, pitying me, paying for my breath, while I apologized for taking up space in my son's home. Carol asked where the money went, her eyes searching my face for an answer I did not have. I shook my head, my mind spinning through a dozen fragmented thoughts. She must have paid the medical bills directly, I told myself. Chelsea must have handled the massive debts in secret so I would not feel the crushing weight of the burden. A heavy fist pounded on the bedroom door, shattering the quiet. Mom, open this door right now. Chelsea's voice was sharp, vibrating with a frantic tone I had never heard her use before. Carol turned the lock, and Chelsea pushed her way inside. One glance at the glowing phone in my hand was all it took. She stepped forward and snatched the device away, slipping it into her pocket with a fluid, practiced motion. You are upsetting him, Chelsea snapped, glaring at her mother with pure venom. Look at his breathing. He is struggling right now because you are confusing him with things he does not understand. My daughter-in-law then turned to me, her features instantly softening into a flawless mask of deep, sorrowful concern. George, those are just pledges on that website. It is not actual money sitting in a bank account waiting to be spent. The platform takes huge fees, and we have to plan for massive future costs that insurance will never cover. She reached out to touch my shoulder. I pulled back, just an inch, but she felt the rejection. The air in the room suddenly grew very cold. You should be grateful, she said, the softness in her voice, now edged with sharp steel. Instead of sitting in this room being suspicious of the woman who is literally keeping you alive. That evening, the house felt suffocating. The walls seemed to press in on me from every side. I waited until Chelsea was upstairs running bathwater for Lily, before I finally cornered Daniel in the kitchen. Did you know about the online fundraiser? I asked him, keeping my voice low and steady. He would not look at me. My only son focused entirely on wiping down the granite counter with a damp sponge, scrubbing a stain that was not there. I knew she asked the church for some help, Dad. I was overwhelmed with work and the house. She handled all the details. Footsteps sounded on the hardwood stairs, light and fast. Chelsea walked into the kitchen, her eyes darting between the two of us. She immediately placed a hand on Daniel's back, a silent claim of territory, and leaned into his shoulder. Do you think I enjoy begging strangers for money? She asked, her voice trembling just enough to sound deeply wounded. Do you think I kept a single penny of it for myself? After everything I sacrificed to keep this household running? Daniel dropped the sponge into the stainless steel sink. Let us not do this right now. Lily can hear everything from the hallway. Normally, I would have folded. I would have apologized for causing tension in their home and retreated to my room. This time, I just turned around and walked away in absolute silence. The house eventually settled into the quiet of the night, but my mind refused to rest. I opened the bottom drawer of my wooden dresser and dug beneath my folded winter sweaters until my fingers brushed against something smooth. I pulled out my old red payroll pencil. For 30 years, I used this exact type of pencil to find missing hours, balance massive district ledgers, and catch tiny discrepancies that no one else saw. Numbers did not lie, and dates always left a trail. I sat at my small desk, turned on the reading lamp, and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. First, I wrote down the total amount, $86,400. Then I wrote down the launch date of the campaign, autumn of last year. I saw the exact month stamped on the bottom of the web page on Carol's phone. I slid the blue folder from the edge of the desk. Chelsea had left it there this morning to make me feel guilty about my oxygen costs. Now, it was no longer a weapon of shame. It was just a stack of unverified data. I flipped to the largest billing statement. The specific page she claimed was a final denial letter that forced her to ask our community for desperate help. A chilling memory surfaced in my mind. It was the afternoon she took that photograph of me sitting by the window. She had asked Daniel to step out of the frame entirely. She wanted to show the world how alone caregiving feels, she had told him. Looking back at the glossy hospital photos on that website, the truth became painfully clear. She was not documenting my illness. She was producing content for an audience. My phone vibrated on the desk, buzzing against the wood. It was a new text message from Carol. She had forwarded an old message Chelsea sent her several months ago. Please do not mention the total to George, the forwarded text read. He is a proud man, and knowing how much people gave would humiliate him beyond words. The sentence sounded fiercely protective on the surface, practically dripping with daughterly love. But underneath the sweet words, it was a locked door. It was a deliberate wall constructed to keep me from knowing the actual truth about the money. I looked back at my blank sheet of paper and picked up the red pencil. I traced a thick circle around the launch date of the online campaign. Then I drew a straight line down the page to the date printed on the supposed denial letter sitting in the blue folder. The timeline was completely wrong. The charity campaign went live exactly 17 days before the terrifying denial letter ever arrived in the mail. I sat back in my chair and stared at the red marks on the page. The cold reality finally settled deep in my chest, replacing the guilt that had lived there for months. Chelsea had not raised money because my oxygen was denied. She had needed my oxygen to be denied because she was already raising money. Morning light crept through the blinds, casting thin shadows across the bedroom floor. I sat at my small desk and opened the web browser on my old laptop. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I needed to see my oxygen supplier account, but the login screen rejected my password twice. When I clicked the recovery button, a masked email address appeared. It started with a C and ended with my son's last name. Chelsea had locked me out. A memory drifted back from 6 months ago. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room flickered in my mind, my daughter-in-law handing me a stack of discharge papers while I was still groggy from the pain medication. The woman had told me to sign the bottom line so she could help schedule my tank deliveries. I gave her permission to help, and she used it to take permanent control. Small footsteps padded down the hallway, breaking my focus. Lily pushed the door open, carrying a sheet of construction paper. She climbed onto the edge of my bed and smoothed out the drawing. It was a picture of a massive kitchen with a new marble island. "Mommy says the kind people helped us get the kitchen we deserve," my granddaughter said, pointing to a brightly colored refrigerator. I turned my chair around. "Which kind people, sweetie?" Lily did not look up from her masterpiece. "The people who help Grandpa breathe?" The door swung wide open. Chelsea stood in the frame, holding a plastic lunchbox. Her eyes darted from the drawing to my face, and the color drained from her cheeks for a fraction of a second. She marched forward, snatched the paper from the bed, and grabbed Lily's hand a little too hard. "You completely misunderstood what we talked about regarding the family budget," Chelsea snapped at the child. "Go get your coat. We are going to be late for school." The moment the front door slammed shut, I stood up and walked to the closet. I dragged out an empty portable oxygen tank and ran my thumb over the faded sticker on the side. A customer service number was printed beneath the barcode. I picked up my phone and dialed. A woman named Maria Alvarez answered on the third ring. I explained who I was and asked for my billing history. "Mr. Bennett, I need to verify your identity before we proceed," Maria said. Her tone was polite but firm. I provided my date of birth, my home address, and the last 4 digits of my social security number. Once she confirmed my file, she explained the privacy rules. She could not discuss my medical details with anyone else, not even family, without an active authorization form. But as the patient, I had the right to request my complete invoices, payment history, and insurance adjustments. Maria offered to mail the packet to my house. I thought about Chelsea sorting through the envelopes on the kitchen counter every afternoon, deciding what I was allowed to see. "Please hold them at the front desk," I told her. "I will come pick them up today." Carol arrived 30 minutes later. She drove a quiet sedan that smelled faintly of vanilla and old leather. Neither of us spoke as she navigated the suburban streets toward the medical supply office. The silence felt heavy, thick with the things we were both afraid to admit out loud. Finally, Carol tightened her grip on the steering wheel. "I should have asked you before I believed her. I am so sorry, George." I looked out the passenger window at the passing trees. "Do not do that, Carol. We both trusted the same person for different reasons." The supplier office was a small brick building tucked behind a pharmacy. Maria Alvarez met us at the reception counter. She glanced at Carol, clearly hesitant, but I placed a hand on my friend's arm and nodded. Maria slid a thick stack of printed paper across the counter. I flipped past the cover sheet and found the account summary. My eyes scanned the columns, searching for the catastrophic debt that had kept me awake for months. It was not there. The equipment rental was entirely current. My recurring oxygen supply was largely covered by my primary insurance. The only remaining balance consisted of modest copays, and those had been paid on time for several consecutive months. Near the bottom of the page, a hardship assistance credit from a respiratory foundation covered the rest. The massive unpaid balance from the blue folder on our kitchen table had simply been the raw charge before any insurance adjustments were applied. "When did my statement stop coming to the house?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Maria tapped a few keys on her computer. "Someone switched your account to paperless delivery 6 months ago. The primary contact email was changed to a different address." She read the address aloud. It belonged to my daughter-in-law. Maria printed the authorization form that allowed the change. I stared at the ink. The signature was absolutely mine, scrawled in my own handwriting, but the date matched my hospital discharge exactly. It was not a clerical error. It was a calculated fence built around my own life. I turned the page and moved to the delivery history. Most of the dates aligned with my memory, but one line near the bottom caught my attention. It was a request to postpone the delivery of a backup oxygen tank. "Why was this delivery canceled?" I asked, pointing to the line. Maria leaned over the counter to look. The notes say the family requested a delay because the patient was traveling out of state for a week. A cold chill swept down my arms. I was not traveling that week. I was home, rationing my air, dizzy and confused. That was the exact week my legs gave out, and I fell against the side table in my bedroom. "Can you print the postponement request?" I asked. Maria nodded, clicked her mouse, and walked over to the printer humming in the corner. She returned a moment later and handed me a single sheet of paper. I read the text slowly. At the very bottom, beneath a polite message explaining my imaginary vacation, was the email address and full name of the person who submitted the delay. Chelsea Bennett. I looked at the date stamped in the top corner of the page. It matched the red pencil timeline I had drawn the night before. It was the exact same day Chelsea had posted a tearful online update for her donors. Her public post had claimed she spent the entire night begging the oxygen company not to abandon her sick father-in-law. While strangers were sending money to save my life, she was the one delaying the very deliveries she claimed to be fighting for. I cleared off the small wooden desk in my room, spreading the documents from Maria Alvarez next to the pages from Chelsea's blue folder. The afternoon sun cast long, hard shadows across the paper, highlighting the stark differences between the two stacks. My red payroll pencil rested in my palm, heavy with 30 years of habit. I started at the top left corner of the real supplier records and moved across, checking dates against the folder my daughter-in-law had left for me. The pattern emerged quickly, obvious to anyone who knew how to look for it. Chelsea had kept the summary pages showing total charges, but she had carefully removed every single page that detailed the insurance payments. On the remaining sheets, she had highlighted the largest numbers in bright yellow marker, adding handwritten notes in the margins. Urgent, one read. Final warning before shut-off, said another. I circled the false notes in red. Every mark felt like a betrayal. She had not just hidden the truth, she had constructed a completely separate reality, designed entirely to keep me afraid. A quiet knock on my bedroom door interrupted the silence. Carol stepped inside, holding a small thermos of tea. She glanced at the papers spread across my desk, her expression tightening, and then she sat on the edge of my unmade bed. I need to tell you something, George, she said, her voice dropping into that serious register she used for bad news. I did not just give a few dollars to that campaign. I gave something important. I put the pencil down, suddenly very tired. How much did she tell you I needed? She said you would lose your oxygen before the winter freeze, Carol answered, staring at the floorboards. She said the insurance had cut you off completely. And you just believed her? Carol finally looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I believed that my daughter was finally taking responsibility. I wanted to believe she was being generous. Why did she never ask you to sign as the beneficiary on that website? Because I would have seen the total, I replied, and I would have known the crisis was fake. The next morning, Carol drove me to Harbor Light Community Church. The building was a massive stone structure wrapped around a modern glass atrium, smelling faintly of floor wax and old hymnals. We sat in the senior pastor's office, surrounded by walls of religious texts and framed community awards. Reverend Nathan Cole sat behind his mahogany desk, his hands steepled in front of him. I pushed the printout of the online fundraiser across the polished wood, followed immediately by the true supplier summary. Nathan leaned forward, adjusting his silver-rimmed glasses. He read the pages in silence for a long time, his jaw muscles working. When he finally looked up, his face was caught somewhere between deep concern and institutional panic. George, this is disturbing, he began, his voice carefully neutral. But you have to understand, the church did not technically operate this campaign. Chelsea promoted it through our mailing lists, yes, but it was an external platform. She used your congregation, Carol said sharply. She used their trust in this church to raise that money. Nathan sighed, leaning back in his leather chair. If we make this public without absolute proof, it could cause a panic among the donors. It could damage the community trust we have spent decades building. And, George, think about Daniel and Lily. Do you really want to drag your son's family through a public scandal? I stared at the man. He was not evil, but he was weak. He was choosing the exact same path my son had chosen, protecting the peace by placing the entire cost on the person who was already bleeding. Before I could answer, the office door opened. Rebecca Sloan, the volunteer treasurer for the church fund, stepped inside holding a thick manila envelope. She was a certified public accountant, sharp and completely uninterested in small talk. Nathan gestured to the papers on his desk. Rebecca, we need you to review the church's direct donation ledger for Chelsea's campaign. Just internally, quietly. Rebecca looked at the documents, then at me. I am not making assumptions without records, Reverend. She turned her attention directly to me, speaking in clear, flat terms. Church donations, platform payouts, personal checks, and medical expenses. All of it has to be matched by date and purpose. A discrepancy on a web page is not proof of theft, Mr. Bennett, but it is enough to start preserving records. She sat down next to Carol and opened her notebook. Do not warn her. Do not accuse her of anything yet. Take screenshots of the live campaign today. Save the update history. Request the payout statements from the platform using your own identity. And revoke any financial access she still has to your accounts. I realized then that revenge was not going to be a shouting match in the kitchen. It was going to require absolute patience. When I returned home that afternoon, Daniel was sitting at the dining table, sorting through the mail. He saw the edge of the supplier documents sticking out of my jacket pocket. I almost told him everything, right then. I almost dropped the papers on the table and demanded he look at what his wife had done. Instead, Daniel smiled, looking more relaxed than he had in weeks. Hey, Dad, Chelsea got some great news today. The community fund is considering her for a leadership role. People finally see how much she sacrifices for this family. I stopped in the hallway. Daniel, have you ever actually seen the bank account for that fundraiser? His smile faltered, replaced by a defensive tightness around his mouth. I trust my wife, Dad. So did I said softly, turning toward my room. I spent the next hour on the phone with my clinic and the oxygen supplier, formally revoking Chelsea's status as my primary contact. I changed the passwords on my patient portal, directing all future notices to a new email address Carol had helped me set up on my phone. It was my first real act of independence in 6 months. Later that evening, long after the house had gone dark, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text message from Rebecca. I opened it, the harsh blue light hurting my eyes in the dark room. I found 3 checks written directly from church members. The message read, the memo lines all say, George Bennett, medical care. My thumb hovered over the screen. I typed back, did they clear? A minute later, her reply appeared. Yes, all 3 were endorsed on the back, but not by you. I sat up in bed, the cold air hitting my chest. Who endorsed them? Chelsea. The heavy oak door of the church office closed behind me with a solid thud. Rebecca Sloan sat across the small conference table, her hands resting on a thin manila envelope. The accountant did not waste time with pleasantries, and I respected her for that. She slid 3 pieces of paper across the polished wood, stopping them right in front of my hands. These are copies of direct checks from church members, Rebecca said, her voice steady and clinical. I looked down at the top sheet. The memo line was printed in neat blue ink, reading simply oxygen support. I moved it aside to look at the second and third. Respiratory treatment, one read, while the final check was clearly labeled as a George Emergency Fund. My eyes caught the name printed on the top left corner of the first paper. It belonged to an elderly cafeteria worker. I remembered helping with a payroll dispute nearly 15 years ago. She lived on a fixed pension, but the woman had written a check for $200 to keep me breathing. Look at the endorsement on the back, Rebecca instructed, pointing a silver pen at the copies. I flipped the page over. The signature was looping and precise. Chelsea had endorsed every single one, and according to the bank routing numbers Rebecca had tracked down, the money went straight into the joint household account my daughter-in-law shared with Daniel. I thanked the treasurer, gathered the copies, and asked Carol to drive me home. The house was perfectly silent when I arrived. Daniel was working a long shift at the logistics company, and Chelsea had taken Lily to a neighborhood playdate. I walked straight into my son's home office. For years, I had been the one authorized to organize their shared filing drawer, keeping their tax documents and appliance warranties in neat alphabetical order. I opened the bottom cabinet, the metal tracks gliding without a sound, and pulled out the thick folder labeled for home maintenance. I spread the contractor receipts across the carpet, placing Rebecca's check copies right beside them. It did not take a certified accountant to see the terrifying pattern. The first donation check had cleared the bank exactly 2 days before the massive deposit was paid to the kitchen demolition crew. The second check aligned perfectly with the purchase date of a luxury stainless steel refrigerator. The third check, the emergency fund meant to save my life, was deposited just a week before a massive payment cleared out Chelsea's personal credit card balance. A bitter memory coated the back of my throat. I remembered the first week of that kitchen renovation clearly. The house was filled with the deafening roar of power saws and a thick haze of drywall dust. I had eaten a bowl of microwave soup alone in my room because Chelsea had stood in the hallway, looking exhausted, and told me we could not afford a restaurant meal or a refill for my portable oxygen. I had sat on the edge of my bed, rationing my air, listening to workers tear down the walls. Strangers had paid for that marble island, believing they were paying for my lungs. The front door unlocked, the deadbolt clicking sharply and breaking the silence. I quickly gathered the papers, slid them back into the drawer, and walked into the hallway. Chelsea was hanging her coat in the closet. Daniel walked in right behind her, looking worn out from his shift. I stepped back into the shadows of the hallway and listened. "He is getting paranoid, Daniel," Chelsea whispered, placing a comforting hand on her husband's chest. "You know how low oxygen affects the brain. It causes confusion, and Carol is just fueling his anxiety because she is lonely." My son rubbed the back of his neck, leaning against the wall. "What are we supposed to do?" "We need to protect him," his wife replied, her tone perfectly sympathetic. "I think we should look into an assisted living community for his own safety. I can schedule a cognitive assessment for him next week, and we can get the paperwork started to take over his financial decisions." My stomach turned to ice. The woman was preparing to label me incompetent. If she successfully framed me as confused, no one would believe a single accusation I made, and the money would remain hers forever. I took a deep breath, plastered a weary expression on my face, and stepped out of the shadows. I called out their names, pretending I had just woken up from a long nap. They both jumped slightly. Chelsea immediately smiled, her caring mask snapping flawlessly into place. "I was just thinking," I mumbled, leaning heavily against the wall to sell the performance of a tired, failing man. I remembered an old unpaid oxygen balance from last winter. "I do not want to leave you two with my debts. If you bring me every single medical bill and all the donation records, I will sign a repayment plan for you." The tension vanished from Chelsea's shoulders instantly. The woman truly believed I was surrendering my independence. "Oh, George, you do not have to worry," she said softly, stepping forward to pat my arm. "But I will clean everything up and organize the papers for you to look at." I nodded slowly and shuffled back to my room. I had just handed my daughter-in-law an open invitation to alter the documents, knowing full well Rebecca was already preserving the originals. A few hours later, a notification pinged on my phone. Rebecca had sent a new message with a digital screenshot attached. She just deleted one of the campaign updates. The text read. I opened the image, zooming in on the text. It was a post from 2 months ago, where Chelsea claimed she had been forced to cancel Lily's birthday trip just to afford my emergency respiratory treatments. My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. Lily had absolutely gone on that trip. There were dozens of pictures of my granddaughter at the beach, still sitting on Chelsea's public social media profile. Deleting the post now meant the woman knew an audit was coming, and she was desperately trying to scrub the undeniable lies. Another message arrived from Rebecca a minute later. After I had submitted a formal identity complaint to the fundraising platform, the website had finally agreed to release a preliminary payout confirmation to my name. The total payout was over $80,000. Based on my real medical records, only a tiny fraction of that massive sum could possibly be linked to my actual care. Footsteps approached my door, slow and hesitant. Daniel knocked gently and pushed the wood open. He held a manila folder in his hands, his eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards. "Dad," my son started, his voice thick with a guilt he could not fully explain. Chelsea scheduled a family meeting for this Sunday. She invited a senior placement counselor to come talk to us. He set the folder down on the small table by my door and walked away without looking back. I walked over and stared at the printed label on the cover. It was an attorney consultation intake packet for protective financial management. My daughter-in-law was not waiting for me to expose her. She was moving first. Chelsea had arranged the living room furniture into a tight circle, creating a stage that felt more like an interrogation room. A silver tray of coffee cups sat untouched on the center table, filling the air with the bitter scent of dark roast. I sat perfectly still in my armchair, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator in the newly renovated kitchen just a few steps away. The senior care placement counselor, a woman introduced as Miss Higgins, sat across from me with a thick clipboard resting on her knees. Reverend Nathan Cole sat to her left, looking deeply uncomfortable in his dark suit. Rebecca Sloan occupied the chair nearest the hallway, her accounting notebook already open. Daniel sat beside his wife, staring at the floorboards, as if they held the answers to a test he had entirely forgotten to study for. Chelsea leaned forward, her voice perfectly pitched to project absolute heartbreak. "My father-in-law has been struggling so much lately," she told the counselor, pressing a tissue to the corner of her dry eye. "He forgets to use his oxygen, and he falls in his bedroom. Lately, he has become terribly confused about our family finances. He thinks people are hiding things from him. My mother has been visiting more often, and while I know she means well, her own loneliness is just fueling his paranoia." Miss Higgins nodded sympathetically, her pen hovering over the intake form. She turned her attention to me, offering a gentle, patronizing smile. She asked me if I knew what day it was, and if I felt overwhelmed by my daily medical routine. I did not raise my voice, and I did not defend myself against the empty accusations. I simply reached into the leather portfolio resting beside my leg. First, I pulled out my current medical instructions, printed directly from the clinic. I handed them to the counselor. Next came the real supplier account summary, proving my bills were paid and my deliveries were current. Then, I handed over the printed confirmation, showing I had independently restored my own patient portal access. Finally, I placed my red pencil timeline on top of the stack. I manage my own medication schedule every morning at 7, I said, my voice steady and clear in the quiet room. I take 2 prescribed inhalers, and I monitor my oxygen saturation every 4 hours. As you can see from those documents, my memory is completely organized, and my concerns about this household are entirely documented. Miss Higgins looked down at the meticulously neat pages. She flipped through the supplier summary, her professional smile fading into genuine confusion. After a long moment, she closed her clipboard and clicked her pen shut. She looked directly at Chelsea and stated that nothing presented in this room justified removing my right to make my own financial or medical decisions. The temperature in the living room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Chelsea stiffened, her hands curling tightly into fists against her lap. She realized her ambush had failed, so she instantly pivoted her attack toward the weakest target she could find. "This is exactly what I mean," my daughter-in-law snapped, glaring at Carol. "Mom, you are doing this to him. You are grieving Dad. You are lonely, and you are desperate to feel useful. You are convincing a sick man that his own family is against him just so you can play the hero." Carol did not flinch. She reached up to her collarbone and pulled the thin silver chain out from beneath her blouse. The clasp hung completely empty against her chest. "Where did my donation go, Chelsea?" Carol asked, her voice carrying a terrifying calm. Chelsea blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the visual evidence missing from her mother's neck. "It went into the general family caregiving expenses." She deflected quickly. "We have so many bills to cover." "Did it go to the oxygen supplier?" Carol pressed, refusing to look away. "I manage the entire household budget," Chelsea argued, her tone rising in volume. "You cannot just separate $1 from another when I am the one keeping this roof over his head." Carol let the empty chain fall back against her shirt. "Your father gave me that wedding ring 38 years ago," she said, the words heavy with an unbearable grief. "I sold it last November and transferred $12,000 into your account. I did that because you stood in my kitchen and swore to me that George was going to die without emergency equipment." A suffocating silence fell over the circle of chairs. Nathan closed his eyes, rubbing his forehead. Rebecca simply kept writing in her notebook. Daniel finally looked up from the floor. He turned his head slowly, staring at his wife as if she were a total stranger. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind clearly racing to connect the pieces of a puzzle he had spent months ignoring. "The kitchen," Daniel whispered, the realization draining the color from his face. "The contractor demanded the demolition deposit the week after Thanksgiving. Did you use your mother's transfer to pay for our cabinets?" Chelsea reached out to grab his arm, but he pulled away. "We needed a safe space to prepare his meals," she pleaded, looking around the room for a single sympathetic face. "The old layout was dangerous. The renovation increased the home value for all of us." I was being practical. It was her first open admission. She had completely bypassed the theft and gone straight to rationalizing the crime. Chelsea turned back to Carol, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. She begged her mother not to destroy her own daughter over a simple misunderstanding about accounting. She pleaded with her to remember the importance of family loyalty. Carol opened her purse and pulled out 2 folded pieces of paper. "I am not destroying you," my friend said quietly. "I am refusing to lie where you have already lied." She handed the pawn shop receipt and the bank transfer confirmation directly to Rebecca Sloan. Miss Higgins excused herself immediately, recognizing a legal disaster when she saw one. Nathan and Rebecca followed shortly after, promising to contact me by the end of the day. When the front door finally closed, Daniel walked over to my chair. He looked broken, a man watching his comfortable life turn to ash. "Dad, please," my son begged, his voice cracking. "Let me handle this privately with her. If this gets out, Lily is going to be ruined at school. We can fix the money quietly." I looked at the boy I had raised. Privacy is what protected her, Daniel. It did not protect Lily, and it certainly did not protect me. "I will not humiliate your daughter, but I will absolutely not hide donor fraud." I left them standing in the living room and walked back to my bedroom. The house felt entirely different now. The mask had cracked, and the pieces were far too jagged to ever be glued back together. Late that evening, my phone vibrated on the desk. It was a text message from Rebecca, sent from her secure office line. I unlocked the screen and read the glowing words in the dark. "The platform just released the full payout ledger to our committee," Rebecca wrote. "There is one specific transaction you need to see before the church honors Chelsea at the caregiver banquet next week. A wire transfer for $5,000. I typed back a single question, asking where the money had gone. Her reply arrived 3 seconds later. It was a payment to a company specializing in personal brand consulting. I sat on the edge of my bed and read Rebecca's message again, staring at the words personal brand consulting. The bright screen illuminated the quiet room, casting long shadows against the walls. For months, I had watched Chelsea film herself in the kitchen, carefully angling her phone to capture the perfect lighting while she talked about the exhausting reality of caregiving. I thought it was just vanity, or perhaps a misguided attempt to find support. Now, I understood the terrifying truth. She was not just spending the donation money on house repairs. She was investing in herself, building a lucrative public image on the foundation of my failing lungs. A few minutes later, I walked into the living room and found my laptop sitting on the coffee table. I opened a new browser window, typed my daughter-in-law's name into the search bar, and pressed enter. The very first result was a professional website, polished and slick. The homepage featured a high-resolution photograph of Chelsea looking thoughtfully into the distance, with the words caregiver advocate spanning across the screen in an elegant font. I scrolled down, my stomach tightening with every click. She was offering paid speaking engagements, online workshops on managing family medical crises, and a weekly newsletter. And right there, embedded halfway down the page, was a promotional video designed specifically to secure her upcoming community award. I clicked play, and the volume filled the empty living room. The video opened with a slow pan across the hospital room from my last admission. Soft, melancholic piano music played in the background while Chelsea's voiceover began. She spoke about the terrifying reality of watching a loved one slip away, cutting to a close-up clip of my face, pale and strapped to a plastic cannula. I never gave her permission to use that footage, and I certainly never authorized the statement that flashed across the screen next. The text claimed that Chelsea had personally paid over $50,000 out of pocket to cover my specialized care. She was not just raising money to improve her house. She was using my medical emergency as a resume. The sound of a key turning in the front door made me snap the laptop shut. Chelsea stepped into the hallway, carrying a stack of mail. She smiled warmly when she saw me sitting in the armchair, and her voice was gentle, completely devoid of the sharp edge she had used during the intervention. "George, I was hoping we could talk," she said, walking over to sit on the edge of the sofa facing me. "Just the two of us." I did not move. I simply waited, watching the practiced empathy settle onto her features. "I know things have been tense lately," my daughter-in-law began, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "And I know you are frustrated, but I want to make things right. I was looking at the budget today, and I think we can afford to get you a brand new, lightweight oxygen concentrator, the really quiet kind." She paused, letting the offer hang in the air. "When I did not react," she continued, her tone dropping into a confidential whisper, "I know this has become painful for everyone, George. Let me make things easier. We can help you move somewhere comfortable, replace every piece of equipment you need, and settle the misunderstandings quietly. Nobody else has to know. We are still family." It was a perfectly calculated bribe. She was offering to buy my silence with my own donation money, framing the entire transaction as an act of familial devotion. "All you have to do," Chelsea added softly, "is sign a short statement saying you reviewed the fundraiser expenses and approved of how the money was managed, just to keep the peace. So we can keep this family together." I looked at the woman sitting across from me, marveling at her absolute lack of shame. "Do you think I should have been told the total amount people gave?" Chelsea did not flinch. "You would have made it impossible to do what needed to be done, George. You are too proud. I took the burden so you would not have to." I knew better than to argue with a person who believed her own lies. I leaned back in the chair and let out a long, exhausted sigh. My memory is not reliable lately. "If you want me to sign something, you need to put it in writing first. Email me a draft so I can read it slowly." Relief washed over her face. She truly believed I had surrendered, broken by the threat of losing my independence. She promised to send the draft immediately and walked upstairs, her step lighter than it had been in days. 10 minutes later, an email arrived in my new, secure inbox. I opened the document and read the words Chelsea had typed. In her rush to secure my compliance, she had handed me the exact weapon I needed. The draft carefully described every donation as a general family caregiving expense rather than medical support. It also asked me to acknowledge that I had reviewed the household records and had no objections to how those funds had been managed. It never admitted wrongdoing, but it quietly erased the original promises made to every donor. It was not a confession of theft, but it was absolute, documented proof of financial concealment. When Daniel returned from work that evening, I asked him to follow me into the kitchen. I laid the laptop on the counter and opened the payout ledger Rebecca had secured. Then, I placed the true medical bills beside it, followed by the dates of the kitchen renovation, the record of Carol's bank transfer, and finally, the draft acknowledgement Chelsea had just emailed me. My son stood perfectly still, his eyes scanning the documents. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale and shaken. He braced both hands against the edge of the marble island, staring at the evidence that shattered his comfortable denial. "I knew community help paid for part of the renovation," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "But she told me the donors specifically wanted to support the whole family. She said they knew how hard we were working." "And you never asked to see the campaign page?" I stated, offering him no easy comfort. "You never asked to see what she promised them." Daniel closed his eyes, a single tear escaping to track down his cheek. He had loved his wife, and he had loved his peace, but the paperwork in front of him made it impossible to pretend anymore. "You have a choice to make right now," I told my son, keeping my voice steady. "You can walk upstairs, warn your wife, and help her destroy the rest of the records. Or you can cooperate with the church treasurer and tell the truth about exactly what you knew." Daniel opened his eyes, looking around the expensive, renovated kitchen as if it were a crime scene. He did not ask for my forgiveness. He simply nodded, pulled out his phone, and unlocked the joint banking application, offering me full access to the household statements. The next morning, Chelsea cornered Reverend Nathan after the Sunday service. Knowing the board was reviewing the accounts, she aggressively pushed to move her recognition ceremony up to Wednesday evening. She believed that if the church publicly celebrated her first, they would never have the courage to reverse course and accuse her of fraud. Rebecca responded by quietly ensuring the ceremony was restructured into a mandatory administrative accounting session. On Tuesday afternoon, a final notification pinged on my phone. Chelsea had posted one last update to her fundraising page. "George's condition has worsened suddenly," the update read, paired with another unauthorized photograph of me sleeping. "We may not have much time left with him. Please keep our family in your prayers during this impossible transition." I sat perfectly upright in my chair, my breathing stable and clear. I read the lie about my own impending death, and the last shred of hesitation vanished from my mind. She was no longer raising money to help me live. My daughter-in-law was preparing to profit from my death. I sat at the small wooden desk in my bedroom, staring at the blank sheet of paper in front of me. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines of light across the stack of documents I had spent the last 2 days gathering. Dozens of pages lay scattered around my reading lamp. Bank statements, medical records, printed emails, and the horrifying payout ledger Rebecca had secured. It was a mountain of information, far too dense and confusing for a public audience to digest. If I walked into that church meeting and just threw a stack of papers on the table, Chelsea would easily twist the narrative. She would claim it was a complicated family dispute over household accounting, and she would win. I picked up my red payroll pencil. For 30 years, my job was to take thousands of scattered numbers and turn them into a clear, undeniable story. It was time to go back to work. I drew 5 vertical columns down the length of the blank paper. At the top of the first column, I wrote the word date. The second column became public claim, followed by actual medical status, donation received, and finally, personal expenditure. I reached for the printout of the original campaign page and logged the launch date in the first row. In the second column, I quoted Chelsea's exact words, claiming my oxygen was about to be shut off. In the third column, I wrote down the truth from my supplier records. My account was current, and my insurance was actively covering the equipment. The story began to build itself, line by red line. I logged the day she received the massive church check, matching it perfectly to the date the demolition crew started tearing down the walls for her new marble kitchen island. I logged the date she posted a tearful update about canceling Lily's birthday trip, matching it to the week the bank statements showed a massive payment, clearing out her personal credit card debt. When I finished, I had condensed 6 months of elaborate fraud into a single devastating page. It was no longer a complicated dispute. It was a map. An hour later, Rebecca arrived at the house. She sat beside me at the desk, reviewing the timeline in silence. The accountant traced my red pencil marks with her finger, nodding slowly as the connections locked into place. "We do not need all of these papers for the meeting," I told her, sliding the massive stack aside. "We only need the 8 strongest pieces of evidence." Rebecca agreed, and together we selected the core exhibits: the original campaign promise, the platform payout ledger, the true supplier balance, the insurance coverage statement, the dates of the renovation deposits, the screenshot of the deleted campaign update, the record of Carol's tragic bank transfer, and finally, the draft acknowledgement Chelsea had emailed me, proving she had completely controlled and concealed the money. Everything else went into a separate folder, held in reserve. Later that afternoon, Reverend Nathan Cole called me on my cell phone. His voice sounded tight, clearly strained by the approaching scandal. "George, I have been thinking about Wednesday evening," the pastor began, clearing his throat. "I still believe the best course of action is to ask for her quiet resignation from all volunteer roles. We can handle the restitution internally. A public confrontation will only hurt the church." I looked out my bedroom window, watching a neighbor walk their dog down the quiet suburban street. "The donors deserve the truth, Nathan. They paid for my life, and they bought a kitchen." "I am trying to protect this community," he argued softly. "Concealing fraud will not protect the community," I replied, my voice steady and firm. "It will just guarantee that the next time someone asks for help, no one will believe them. If you try to cover this up, I will take these 8 documents straight to the police department." A long, heavy silence stretched across the line. The pastor finally let out a defeated sigh. He agreed to pause Chelsea's appointment, freeze the remaining church-controlled funds, and allow Rebecca to present an independent report before any awards were handed out. He promised to forward all the material to the platform and the church's legal counsel immediately after the meeting concluded. When Daniel returned from work, I met him in the hallway. He looked exhausted, the weight of his wife's choices dragging his shoulders down. "I need you to arrange for Lily to stay with a friend on Wednesday evening," I told my son. "She should not be in that room, and she should never see her mother humiliated." Daniel nodded, his eyes filling with tears. I wrote a statement, "Dad," for the board. He handed me a single sheet of paper. I read it quickly. It was entirely factual. He admitted that he knew the fundraiser existed, that he had never bothered to review the campaign page, and that he had knowingly benefited from the expensive renovations. He confessed that he had accepted Chelsea's explanations because they were convenient, and he acknowledged his failure to protect me. "I am not going to edit this to make you look better," I told him, folding the paper in half. "I know," Daniel whispered, turning away. "I do not want you to." My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a new voice message from Chelsea. She was out running errands, preparing for her big night. I pressed play, holding the speaker close to my ear. "George, please stop this," my daughter-in-law cried, her voice thick with manufactured panic. "Mom has always favored you, but if you do this, Daniel is going to lose his marriage. Lily is going to be bullied at school, and you are going to die completely alone because you pushed away the only person who cared for you." I almost wavered. The threat of dying alone was a cold hand gripping my chest. But then I listened to the message a second time. She never once asked if I was hurt. She never apologized for stealing my dignity. She only listed the things she was about to lose. Rebecca sent me one final text message before I went to sleep. "I found the missing link," she wrote. "Look at the date." She increased the overall fundraising goal. I checked the timeline. Chelsea had quietly raised the campaign goal from $35,000 to nearly $100,000, the exact day after she received the final insurance statement, proving my equipment was fully covered. She knew the real cost, and she chose to intensify the false crisis anyway. The next evening, I arrived at Harbor Light Hall. The parking lot was full, and the entrance was decorated with white balloons. I walked through the double doors and stopped at the edge of the large reception room. A massive banner hung above the stage, printed in elegant gold letters, honoring Chelsea Bennett, a daughter's love in action. On every single table, resting next to the dinner plates, was a small donation card printed with the photograph of my sleeping face. Chelsea saw me standing in the doorway. She broke away from a group of smiling church members and walked quickly toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. She leaned in close, her perfect smile never wavering for the cameras flashing around us. "Please, George," she whispered, her voice tight with desperation, "do not ruin this for me." I looked up at the massive banner displaying my name, and then down at the red pencil resting in my front pocket. "I did not come to ruin it, Chelsea," I answered quietly. "I came to correct it." The reception room of Harbor Light Hall buzzed with the low murmur of 50 well-dressed church members. Waiters in crisp white shirts moved between the round tables, pouring ice water and setting down plates of catered chicken. Chelsea walked to the front of the room, her designer dress brushing against the wooden stage, and picked up the microphone. The crowd quieted down instantly. My daughter-in-law offered them a practiced, fragile smile. "Caregiving is a silent sacrifice," Chelsea began, her voice echoing through the speakers with perfect emotional resonance. "It means sleepless nights, financial hardship, and watching someone you love struggle for every single breath. But family means standing together, and I would spend every last dollar again just to keep George breathing." Thunderous applause broke out across the room. Several women at the table nearest the stage wiped their eyes with linen napkins. I remained seated in the back row, my hands folded perfectly still in my lap. I did not clap, and I did not look away from the stage. Reverend Nathan Cole stepped up to the podium, waiting for the applause to die down. He adjusted the microphone stand, his hands gripping the metal tightly. "Before we proceed with the award," Nathan announced, his voice trembling slightly, "the church board must address a series of urgent financial questions regarding the community fundraiser." The smile slipped from Chelsea's face for a fraction of a second before she forced it back into place. She nodded gracefully and stepped back from the podium, acting as if she welcomed the transparency. Rebecca Sloan walked onto the stage, holding the thin manila folder containing the 8 exhibits we had prepared. The accountant did not smile. She stood in front of the congregation and stated clearly that this was not a criminal proceeding, but a formal donor accountability review requested by the church leadership. The lights dimmed, and the projector hummed to life. The massive screen behind the stage lit up with the original fundraising page. This campaign promised that all donations would go directly to oxygen and respiratory treatment, Rebecca read, her voice cutting through the silent room like a knife. I stood up from my chair. Every head in the room turned toward me. "I did not create that page," I said, my voice projecting clearly to the front row. "I did not approve the photographs used on that website, and I did not receive those funds. I was told my treatment was completely unaffordable." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Chelsea gripped the edge of the podium, her knuckles turning white. She opened her mouth to speak, but Rebecca pressed the button on the projector remote. The screen shifted, displaying my red pencil timeline. "The donations entered a joint household account," Rebecca explained, pointing to the columns of data. "However, the oxygen supplier account was entirely current, and insurance covered most of the recurring costs. The campaign funds coincided directly with a major kitchen renovation and personal brand consulting expenses. Furthermore, the fundraising goal was intentionally increased the day after insurance coverage was confirmed." The murmurs grew louder, shifting into an uncomfortable, tense buzzing. Chelsea leaned into the microphone, her voice rising in volume. "Caregiving expenses include the household," she argued, sweeping her arm out toward the crowd. "You all know how expensive it is to maintain a safe home for an elderly patient. Then why did the campaign not say that?" Rebecca countered flatly. Chelsea had no clean answer. She stared out at the audience, her jaw working as she desperately searched for a sympathetic face to rescue her. Carol walked forward from the front row. My friend did not march up the stairs to attack her daughter. She simply stood at the base of the stage, opened her purse, and pulled out 2 pieces of paper. "I sold the last thing your father left me," Carol said, holding up the pawnshop receipt and the bank transfer confirmation. "Because you told me George might stop breathing before winter. You used my grief to finance a lie." Chelsea recoiled as if she had been slapped. "Mom, you are choosing strangers over your own child." "No," Carol replied, her voice breaking on the final word. "I am choosing the truth over the child who thought being mine made her untouchable." Daniel stood up from his seat near the center aisle. He held his single sheet of paper in shaking hands. He read his statement exactly as he had written it, admitting his silence, his passivity, and his undeniable benefit from the stolen funds. He did not ask the audience for forgiveness, and his confession instantly stripped Chelsea of her final defense. She could no longer claim this was just a targeted attack by a paranoid father-in-law and a lonely mother. Chelsea turned away from the crowd and looked directly at me. Her mask was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, furious desperation. "Everything I did was to keep this family together," she said. The words practically spat from her lips. "No," I answered, walking down the center aisle until I stood face to face with the woman who had stolen my dignity. "You made me afraid to breathe so strangers would pay to watch you pretend to care." The room fell into an absolute, deafening silence. I reached into my suit jacket, pulled out the formal document revoking any remaining financial or medical authorization, and placed it on the podium right in front of her. Then, I turned around and walked toward the exit. Behind me, Reverend Nathan stepped back to the microphone. He announced that the board had voted to suspend Chelsea from all volunteer roles, freeze the remaining church funds, remove the caregiver award entirely, and issue a formal notice to every single donor. The matter was being referred immediately to the fundraising platform, the bank, and the local authorities for investigation. Chelsea was not handcuffed on the stage. She simply stood there, frozen under the heavy, judging gaze of the exact community she had manipulated for fame. After the reception room emptied out into the parking lot, I stood by my car in the cool evening air. Rebecca walked out of the double doors, holding her manila envelope tightly against her chest. The platform just located an additional series of donations Chelsea never disclosed to the church, the accountant told me. Her voice hushed. The amount is large enough to move this case far beyond any private restitution agreement. I looked out at the dark street. What happens next? Now, Rebecca said softly, the truth leaves this room. The polished mahogany table in the mediator's office felt cold beneath my fingertips. 2 weeks had passed since the church ceremony, and Chelsea sat across from me with her attorney, a quiet man in a gray suit. He pushed a thick, cream-colored folder across the wood. The proposed private settlement offered partial repayment and demanded complete confidentiality, ensuring my daughter-in-law would face no admission of wrongdoing. Daniel sat beside me, his shoulders slumped under the weight of an exhausted silence. My son turned his head, his eyes red from lack of sleep, and asked me to consider the deal just to protect Lily from the public shame. I looked at the heavy paperwork, thinking about the elderly cafeteria worker who had sent a $200 check. I slid the folder back across the table. I will not sign a confidentiality agreement, I told the lawyer, keeping my voice perfectly level. The donors deserve formal notification, and my silence is exactly what allowed the abuse to continue. I did not demand the harshest possible punishment, but I demanded a totally truthful accounting. Over the following months, the slow wheels of the legal system began to grind forward. The fundraising platform officially confirmed the campaign misrepresentation, and subpoenaed bank records heavily documented the diversion of those funds. The remaining money in the joint account was permanently frozen. Once the prosecutors reviewed the undeniable evidence of elder financial exploitation and fundraising fraud, Chelsea finally surrendered. She entered a formal plea agreement rather than face a highly publicized trial. The consequences were serious and absolute. The judge handed down a felony fraud conviction, ordering full restitution for the provable amount she had stolen. Her sentence included a period of structured county confinement, followed by years of supervised probation and mandatory financial disclosures. The court also strictly prohibited her from ever organizing charitable campaigns or managing another person's finances again. To satisfy the heavy restitution order, the state forced the sale of Chelsea's luxury vehicle. The unused renovation materials sitting in the garage were quickly liquidated. Daniel, finally accepting the reality of his own passive complicity, took out a personal loan to repay the portion of the kitchen renovation from which he had knowingly benefited. The platform notified the original donors, offering them direct refunds or the option to transfer their money to a legitimate medical charity. Carol eventually received a bank transfer, returning her $12,000. She could not, however, recover the original wedding ring she had sold. The fallout shattered the foundation of my son's comfortable life. Daniel and Chelsea legally separated, driven apart by the undeniable facts of the investigation and his own failure to protect me. My son packed his bags, moved into a much smaller apartment across town, and immediately began attending counseling. He visits me only by invitation now, because I told him that while I still love him, rebuilding my trust will require years of consistent, honest action. Lily remains protected from the darkest adult details, told simply that her mother made serious choices and is facing the necessary consequences. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I met Carol at a local diner. The smell of roasted coffee beans and fried potatoes filled the warm air. I handed her a small wooden box across the booth. She opened the lid slowly, her hands shaking just a little. Inside rested a bright photograph of her and Paul, along with a copy of the donation receipt stamped with the word "repaid." Coiled perfectly next to the paper was the simple silver chain clasp, freshly repaired by a local jeweler. I did not try to replace her husband's ring with an expensive new one, because doing so would have cheapened her terrible loss. Carol touched the silver medal, offering a sad, quiet smile. She told me the empty chain would always remind her of what the truth cost, and why it was still absolutely worth paying. A year later, my own life looks very different today. I packed up my belongings and moved into an accessible, independent senior apartment located just 3 blocks from my pulmonary clinic. I manage my own oxygen deliveries, and I keep my portal passwords completely private. I attend my rehabilitation sessions every Thursday, breathing a little easier with every passing week. My chronic illness did not magically disappear, but my dignity returned. I placed the silver-framed photograph of Elaine on my new nightstand, resting my old red payroll pencil right beside it. I no longer apologize to anyone when the concentrator kicks on and fills the room with noise. The public scandal did not destroy Harbor Light. Instead, the painful transparency reformed it. The church board established a new transparent respiratory support fund, complete with a strict 2-person approval process, mandatory beneficiary confirmation, and public quarterly accounting. They explicitly banned the use of patient images without written medical consent. They asked me to serve as an honorary advisor, and I accepted the role. Last week, we met with our very first recipient. She was an elderly woman from the neighboring county who had been skipping her breathing treatments because she could not afford the mounting copays. She sat in the church office, twisting a tissue in her hands, apologizing for taking up our time. I recognized the deep, suffocating shame in her eyes immediately. I slid the approval paperwork across the table, offering her a pen. "Your breathing is not a debt you owe anyone," I told her, making sure my voice carried absolute certainty. That night, I lay in my own bed, looking up at the ceiling. Chelsea's worst theft was never the money. Her greatest crime was forcing me to believe that my life had to justify its basic cost. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool rush of air flow through the plastic cannula. The oxygen machine hummed loudly beside me all night long. For the first time in months, I did not hear the cost. I heard proof that I was still here. You watch situations like this unfold on your screens every day, perhaps without even realizing it. The world loves a martyr, and society is always quick to applaud the exhausted caregiver who sacrifices everything for an aging parent. But this story holds a mirror up to a much darker reality, one that thrives behind closed doors and carefully curated social media posts. The lesson here is not just about stolen money, it is about the theft of dignity. When someone constantly reminds you of exactly how much your existence costs them, they are no longer providing care, they are building a cage. You have to understand that elder financial abuse rarely starts with a stolen credit card or a forged signature. It usually begins with a seemingly innocent offer to help. It starts when a relative takes over the passwords to your patient portal, when they sort your mail before you can see it, and when they slowly cut you off from speaking directly to your own doctors and suppliers. The most dangerous weapon an abuser has is your own guilt. They make you feel like a terrible burden, so that you will stop asking questions, stop demanding transparency, and silently surrender your autonomy. You must remember that holding on to your financial independence and your medical privacy is not an act of ingratitude. It is your absolute right. Never hand over the keys to your life just because someone tells you they are trying to make things easier for you. You also need to recognize the devastating cost of silence, a lesson the son in this story had to learn the hard way. Peace bought by looking the other way is not peace at all. It is simply complicity. Sometimes, doing the right thing means making the hardest choice imaginable, just as the mother-in-law did when she stood in front of her church and refused to lie to protect her daughter. Real family ties require accountability. If someone's affection for you depends entirely on your willingness to stay quiet and small, that is not love. It is control wearing a very kind face. Take a moment and think about your own life, your own family, and the people around you. Have you ever been made to feel like your basic needs were an unbearable burden to the people who were supposed to care for you? Have you ever watched someone play the role of the perfect, suffering caregiver in public, while you knew the terrifying truth of what was really happening in private? How do you find the courage to reclaim your voice when the people manipulating you are your own flesh and blood? I know many of you carry similar scars, and you carry them in silence because speaking up feels like tearing your family apart. But your experiences matter, and your dignity is not a debt you owe to anyone. Please, share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments section below. Let us stand by one another and build a space where the truth is spoken out loud, where we set firm boundaries, and where no one ever has to apologize just for taking a breath. If this fight for justice struck a chord with you, hit the subscribe button and join our channel so we can continue shining a light on the truths that need to be heard.